Okay, I'm going to do a little discussion here on something else that I don't usually talk about, but if you've watched all my videos and stuff and gone through them, you can tell that I've had other interests and things throughout my life, and one of the major ones was aquatic fish and, of course, corals that come mainly from saltwater aquariums in the saltwater ocean. It's quite different than the fish and everything that'll live in freshwater and saltwater. And there are very few creatures that are like salmon and things that will actually go out in the ocean and then come back up into freshwater. But of course, that's a terminal phase. After they've gone through the whole thing, on the way back, they mate, and that's the end of it. Well, I've always found things like that to be extremely strange and a unique type of life, and wanted to study about unique types of life and stuff. And wow, it's so different. It's goes back to being a kid and watching Jacques Cousteau and seeing him start out above the ocean, which and a dusky appearance is just a blanket of blue that's wiggling. And he says the ocean, a blanket of blue, and he drops the camera below, and he says, but below, and there's fish swimming around and corals and everything, and he talks about how it's a wonderful world. And join me today as we discuss and see the wonders of the ocean. And thought it was just amazing. You could put on a mask and it was just like, boom, you're in an artificial world. You might as well actually be on another planet. There are so many exotic things. We take them for granted because we grew up with them and everything, but might as well be on another planet, including corals. And what kind of spurred me to do this was I watched a video, which are far too often and far too common nowadays, about coral bleaching and how they want to talk about climate change and spank your hand while they do it and try to get control over what they're doing to you and the planet and all these other things and get you to really agree with it. And I don't think there's a person listening to this that doesn't agree that we need to be careful and watch all the trash that we put out and things, and trash that'll lead into rivers, which, if you don't think about it, leads down and into oceans and can cause extreme problems. Well, the one I was watching was on the Great Barrier Reef, and I kind of wanted to see it because, and it was done just this last year, end of last year, was to see if how much correction that there's been in the area, because the Great Barrier Reef's not just one thing, but it's thousands of little coral reefs, like atolls and little islands and stuff, that are surrounded by corals all the way to a depth of over 100 meters. And there are some types that can live below that, but most of them live off sunlight and nutrient that's pulled out of the water. And they have inside their skin something that's called zooxanthellae, and that's what we're kind of looking at now. Here's an extreme close-up, and it's a unicellular creature, and there are a lot of different colors. This one is kind of a brownish orange copper tone, and so not a ugly brown, but it would have been a kind of shiny penny-ish kind of copper tone. And there are variations of this that can actually get really metallic looking to your eyes, especially when you have the correct lighting to grow coral reefs over them. And it requires a certain amount of things to go on, and it puts you into just not somebody that just has something you may throw food in every once in a while, but you actually become a hobbyist because you don't want to let this volume of water start to go out in left field, because when it goes out in left field, you could lose corals. They'll do a thing called bleaching, and they'll start losing their color and so on, and then they'll just wig out. Now, whenever you see this in your reef, you wonder, of course, is my water quality bad? And this is the canary in the coal mine that started me showing that I'm going way out in left field. And quite often it is. But other factors are totally in play sometimes. Sometimes you've gotten a coral from a lesser light situation, and when putting it in your artificial reef, you have an extreme lighting condition. To grow some of the corals require heavy lighting, and it's just too much for it. It bleaches out. But all of these endeavors are, of course, man-made, like nothing goes on without us. No, that was just sarcasm. For these things come and go and live and die and things like that. Being surrounded by all these little shallow islands and shallow reefs that are there, the sunlight's able to penetrate down to the bottom pretty much in a lot of the open areas, like are in the Florida, in the balmy areas, if you know what I'm talking about. And the water gets a lot warmer. This is real good for swimming, living, and everything, but if it'll reach a certain point, corals don't do well. They get too warm and it doesn't do well. So you need to have this Goldilocks zone, and people realize this Goldilocks zone is everything from about 69 degrees, so 70 degrees and above, up to about 84. Now, 84 is pushing it, and so is 70 for most things. But if you were to get some corals off of, say, California coast that grow there, which there's not an abundance of exotics, but if you got some that grew there, then they would actually thrive in this colder environment, and you probably couldn't get many to exist in the 84 degree range. So you try to hit the middle of the road. 76, 78 is real good. And so there's this constance with it. Now, people will get these lighting systems on them, and they used to use halide lights. And these things are so hot, if you touch them with your skin, it peels your skin right off. It's extremely radiative heat, like our sun is, and you feel it on your body, and it starts to heat up that aquarium. And sure, it's moving water around and down through the filter and back up, but it starts to build up heat. So they put chiller units and things like that on them, and those are controlled by a thermostat. And so as it gets warmer, they turn on and turn back off if it gets cool enough to stop. A lot of people have their lights kind of pivot up and down a couple of times through the day to alleviate this, but also to act like clouds come over, things like that. There's a lot of things that you do artificially, and so you have to recreate their environment. Salt water's intricate. It contains 72 trace elements, but a lot of those are what's considered essential elements, and they're used for the coral's growth, like their skin uses iodine. And if they're a skeleton growing coral, like anemones don't have a skeleton inside of them, they're just stuck onto a rock, right? But other corals, just inside that membrane, are growing a calcareous or calcareous skeleton, like bone. And it requires calcium. So back whenever the hobby was really first going, people do that, and they were putting calcium in the water and trying to peg the number or slightly above, never falling below. And they noticed, some doctors, especially an osteoporosis doctor, noticed that when his corals would bleach out and die and do things, that he would look at them and their skeletons seemed fairly perforated. He was trying to figure out what it was. So he had his water analyzed to the nth degree, seeing all the parts moving of everything that's in that. Some of these tests back in the day were extremely hard to get, but you could fractionate water and it would tell you. This is like whenever they put it in a grass chromatograph and things like that. Somewhat expensive, but hey, this man's hooked up with a machine that does it in the first place. And he found that strontium and magnesium was a little low. Strontium way low of his numbers that he was supposed to be hitting, or that natural seawater shows in its boundaries. So he started adding it back into his system, and he started having less problems, and the coral skeletons were growing more thick and fibrated. It's why you see in Centrum Silver, they say, well, strontium and magnesium. And you're like, well, weren't they crazy about calcium? Yeah, they were, and it was causing people to have kidney stones and all kinds of stuff because their body couldn't metabolize it. It takes a certain amount of thing, strontium, magnesium, to go with it. So not only have we learned from the ocean, but we are like the ocean. Our tears are like the ocean. We keep a salt level in our body that's very much similar to the ocean, believe it or not. So everybody talks about high blood pressure and salt's bad and everything, and there's a point to that. But there's also a reason it needs to be there. Back to the main topic here, I guess, and we're going to keep rolling through it like this. You'll see these polyps here, and so what you're seeing is they're polyps sticking out. Now, normally this just looks like a little bump of crowns, and all of these polyps are all closed in all day long, and he's sun shining. Most of these at nighttime, though, they'll take and put out their polyps and try to catch food. Others are sun shining and polyps are out all day long, and at nighttime they may suck in. They have the ability to pull them in and out, so it's a lot more going on than like a flower. because it can instantly react. You can touch these things and they suck in real quick. Well, what's that all about? They have a brain, believe it or not. So these are not just animals, that are plantimals, if you will. And they have a brain type thing hooked up to it, and they know to protect themselves. And there are fish called butterfly fish, which were named so because they're fleeting along the reef just like on flowers, but they're not pollinating them. They're actually eating the individual polyps. And so they have the ability to retract their polyps in. And the real delicate part of that, and doesn't have much protection, are the polyps whenever they're sticking up like this. But what it does have is nematocysts. This is a stinging device right on the, usually on the little tips, and it's very much like on jellyfish or something like that, and little bitty micro shrimps, smaller than dust, just micro shrimps, what they call copiopods, decapod, unipod, ganapod, and they start to get larger and larger, will fall into these things, and there's a sting going on, and it paralyzes them, and then they close the polyp up. In fact, you can actually feed these things like brine shrimp and stuff, mysis shrimp, and give them a piece and they'll eat it. And it's good for you to do it, but every once in a while there's a particulate that we used to just use particulate flake food, but now they've procured all of these copepods and stuff in mass in different variations of them, and kind of flash dehydrate them, and you can take them and water them back up and put a little trace elements that they really need in their body in it, and then flick it in the aquarium, and it'll float around and they catch stuff. Now you can't do that too much, because if you do and all the nutrient isn't consumed, it starts to form nutrient in the water, and nutrient causes algae. And in this thing I was watching, they were showing how brown algae takes over, and it's kind of disgusting whenever I see them make all these statements and put all this stuff together, and it's like, that's not really how it's working. One of the major areas that they saw in Great Barrier Reef that were having a problem was off of Lord Howe Island, and they had crown of thorns starfish, and they go around eating corals. Now in Lord Howe Island, they put this submerged submarine right off the coast there with a pier up to it, and so basically you go climb in the submarine like you would, but you can see out into the ocean. And this is a thing that was done for them. It's been done in a few places, but it was famous there, and people would go out there and see this, and so they could look upon the reef. Well, these crown of thorns starfish were around there, and they were ruining the look of the reef right there out the windows that the people were looking out of. So smartly, they got one of the divers to go out there and kill them. But he did the wrong thing, for whenever he got them, he just chopped them up in pieces. And lo and behold, a starfish can regenerate, and there's a pretty good chance of it. And therefore, when he chopped them up in pieces, and these things got multiple arms, he just made a whole lot more of his problem, and it's right out there. And so it started ruining the exhibit. So that's one thing that happens. But in that same area, and up further north of that, near Queensland, they had an area that was getting bleached out. The corals weren't so fancy anymore. People that would go out to dive in things, they were noticing that this whole area and this nothing is starting to happen, and this nothing is growing. And they couldn't figure out what it was. And they sent all kinds of divers there and doing all kinds of things. And I was keeping up with this whenever it was going on, way back in the 80s and early 90s. And they come to find out, well, someone got smart enough to realize, well, it seems to emanate just about where this river is running into the area. So what's new and different in this area are up that river or going on. So the guys ditched the ocean and went inland and figured out that there's a whole lot of new plantations that had gone in there in the last 5 or 6 years, and they started fertilizing, and their fertilizer runoff is going into the river and creeks, going into that river and leaching it out in the ocean, and it's causing a bunch of brown algae to grow. Well, fast forward to the other people studying these crown of thorns starfish, and there are people that are doing illegal things, because crown of thorns are extremely bad. But she's actually trying to keep them alive and trying to get them to grow to see what things it takes to make it happen. And they can't get it to make it happen. But they get too much nutrient buildup, and a couple of them die in there, and it rots the water a little bit, and they get a little brown algae, and all of a sudden they start doing fantastic. And they realize that they're living off of that, so that's feeding it and made the whole problem start leading into the whole thing. And it became extremely worse after the corals had already been mauled by these extra crown of thorns starfish. There's not 4 or 6 in a square mile, there's 400. And just a group of them can just migrate through an area, and it's like buffaloes coming through your farmland. And after they get through, it's like, what? And if they would eat just the brown ones, that'd be one thing. But no, they got to eat the other ones. And they showed in this video bleaching events of coral, and they showed a lot of corals turning brown. I'm here to tell you that 85% of these corals are brown. 10% of them are green, and then a smaller percentage of them will get reds and orange and yellows and things like that in them. And zooxanthellae has millions of different colors. You looked at some of my videos that I've got of these zoanthids, which starts with the same word as zooxanthellae, like zoological, and the variation. And even the little rings inside them only want certain colors and not certain other colors. You'd think if red was strong, it'd be red, 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 and red fringe with red tips. But no, it's green in the center with a red ring around it, with little blue dots around the side of that, and then the tubes that are coming up are banded green and red with an orange tip. You're like, what? Well, I always wanted to study what makes that happen, but also the first thing you're really studying is how can I keep that from not going away and dying. And I was kind of a pioneer in this, where I just thought of simple things, like people were getting way out in left field catering to numbers, and I was saying that might help a lot of these guys, but over long term, it's probably hurting these others, and it's a stress that they can't go over. You need to find the middle of that road, and even though we'll cater a little that way, then there's still a middle of a road. Even though we've gone a little right, there's a little middle of the road still. When you drive not in the center of the road on the line, you drive on the right-hand side, but there's a middle of that. And you don't want to go too far over, thump, 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 and if you start going this way, and you watch out. So you kind of stay in the middle of it. Well, these bleaching events, they show pictures like this, and they say that's bleaching and stuff, right? Well, lo and behold, if you look at most of the polyps when they come out, the polyps are pretty clear. They don't have zooxanthellae in them because they're not sunning. They're pretty much internal all day long, and then they pop out. So the ones that are like that won't have much color to the polyps. Other things have a lot of color, like the zooxanthelids that I talked about. And zooxanthids are a different type of polyp, though, and there's so many different types of flowers here. And one wonders what makes a rose red. And can you get different colors? Because there's this one coral, it's got this cool purpley red color to it, but it's the only one in the area. How can I make the other corals ditch the brown and pick up that vibrant rosy red? Well, it turns out brown is stronger. It goes off of nutrient levels and things and is much more eager to go either way, and so if there's any hiccups and things start to bleach, it's easier for it to turn in and brown out, as they say, or green out. And because there's so many corals that are brown and green, people kind of try to steer away from those. You don't want a coral reef, built in your house there, a fake little coral reef, and all it has is a bunch of brown corals like this. And you can see these little dots that are inside of its body here, and that's those, if you zoom in real close, those little orangey brown dots that are in there are green, are different colors. And you'd be surprised whenever you think that it's red, so they're all red, and then you zoom in on it, there's a lot of different colors of red, and they're all living together. They're all doing their thing. Where do they get it from? Well, they suck it in out of the ocean and respirate it into their body, and then it starts growing like a haven. People don't think about this, and a lot of people that were way into this were amazed whenever I gave them the connotation or the idea that zooxanthellae being in their skin is much like chlorophyll in a tree. And while a tree is sitting in the soil and got roots and pulling it up, these things are living in the soil that they get the nutrient out of and don't have that effect. Oh, they're footing, so they're attached to something, but other than that, so there's a little attachment point, and this thing slowly grew and multiplied and fibrated and tree branched and looked like this probably when it was real little, but each little branch splits into twos and fours and everything. And while that was a little bitty guy on the end of it, as it grows and grows, that area becomes real thicker. And some of these corals table out, so they're expanding their leaf like those big elephant ear type things. But the coral's colors that are inside of it are basically growing off the light, just like it would in others. Now, they show a lot of these colorful corals, like this one even is about zooxanthellae, and they show a carnation coral. And this variation of carnation coral is not photosynthetic. It has super fuzzy little cottony things on the end, and that's millions of polyps. They only grow in a nutrient-rich area and just right. Got to have the current going across them and all this, and it's hard to keep them in the presence of the other corals without the other corals getting too much. In fact, these start to get too much light and they try to shed off their skin sometimes, getting rid of algae trying to grow on it, and it causes them extra stress. You have to pretty much, they wouldn't want direct lighting. In a reef where you're growing all these other corals, you'd have to put them in a cave where they're getting indirect lighting at best. And that'd be a good place to get them too for the nutrient that comes by. Can't really realize it here, but see how dark blue it is out beside that thing there. And that's because they're probably 60, 70, 80 foot in the ocean. You won't find them real close to the surface. And that's another thing. You find certain corals real close to the surface and still growing towards the light. You find other ones that will not live there. They live down in that 20, 30, 40, 50 foot range and pretty much die out right in there. And you've got to give them that much light. And so if you have way too much light, you've got to drop him down in your aquarium. If you don't have enough, you've got to bring him up. And if you don't have enough light, then some of these real highlight corals, you don't have enough light to grow. And you notice that when you get in the ocean that everything's blue. Well, the way that works is all the light, when it penetrates the water, it just scatters. And red, orange, yellow forms of light scatter out real easy, but blue's a long wavelength and it penetrates all the way down. And so it makes the ocean appear to be blue. It's still got the same amount of light. There is that amount of blue or more coming out of the yellow sun that you're looking at constantly. It's hard to believe it, but it's a full spectrum. A lot of people say our eyes are geared to be against it because there's so much blue in the sky that we had to change. Our vision is changed or tweaked slightly, kind of earth tone tweaked, so we can see all of those colors, and so those colors stand out to us, like we're picking fresh berries and things along like that line, right? So here's those zooxanthellae, real close up, and there's a little greenish and kind of orangey swirls in this brown matrix, and that might look kind of coppery, but you can get it to look even more coppery. Let's see what other pictures we can see here as we talk about it. But they show you things bleaching out like this, and how it turned to like that. Well, that's not the same coral. And some of these guys can be white, and some of them can be orange, and some of these aren't even photosynthetic corals that are showing you this happening to, and so it's not really right. Now, this is a flower pot coral, and it looks like little flower daisies all sticking up, and it's kind of brownish with lighter tips, right? But if you look in my videos, I've got one of these that are hot pink. They come out of Bali, and they're a weird fluorescent hot pink. And if you get them in the right lighting, like let's zoom in on this. I know it makes it real fuzzy, but if you get them in the right lighting, what we have here is about as much blue as we have yellow lighting, and the yellow lighting is still full spectrum, right? Going over it, and you get a whole lot of beautiful colors. And I've seen pictures of natural reefs where they usually don't look like this, but sometimes they get this exotic in areas. But this is also corals from Fiji, Bali, and here that never really are in those other places in some instances, and so you're making an artificial reef that doesn't exist. And of course, you're picking the real colorful ones. I can find something yellow and orange and red and a different red. Now I've got some greens in there, but I don't want a whole bunch of green and brown with an occasional red thing. That's the way it looks out in the wild a lot of times. And they grow down in their body, the skeleton of the coral, and it's slowly growing up over time. And the polyps stay on the top of that. And as it grows wider between here, it'll put up a fresh new polyp and keep going. But there's a membrane on the outside and inside, and in this thin membrane that lives in between here, right there, zooxanthellae will live in this membrane, and that's what gives it the coral, its color. And they show pictures like this. Well, this is what it looks like to your eye and to a sad camera. But when you get down real deep and you're past the point that red light and yellow light and orange light even shows up, something that's red and orange kind of looks brown, dull, even compared to the rest of the things. And you'll still see some greens and a bunch of browns. But if you've got one of those blue lights, everything glows in the dark. So anyhow, this video that they're showing, they talk about how it's bleaching out and it's doing this and the temperatures are going on. And I guess one main point I wanted to make was that whenever they're doing this, they're losing their color because they're losing their zooxanthellae. But pretty much they say, oh, it's from coral bleaching is from temperature. Well, you've got to realize that those coral reefs have been growing a lot longer than we've been knowing we're we. Yeah, one important thing to this, here's a natural coral reef right here, and here's where they found, oh, that's real cool. There's some of these rosy cat's paws, they call them, because each individual thing looks kind of like a cat's paw, but there's hundreds on each one. It's cat's paws. But then there's this staghorn coral, but it's just brown. Now there's staghorn corals that are bright green and stuff, and some multicolors, but this is not them. So this is what you're usually seeing. It's reflected off the bottom. Oh, isn't that cool? It's just beautiful. There's zooxanthellae. So it's kind of a chlorophyll thing, but whenever we had that El Nino, La Nina event that you heard about that are hurting those coral reefs off of Brazil, Mexico, this event was kind of odd. What happened was it got a little warmer than it should, then whoop, it got a little colder, then it washed back over with warmer again, and so on. And so it was the perfect storm, or the whoopsie plus a little, minus a little, plus a little, and that exaggeration caused a problem. Well, as it killed off that reef there, they had biologists all go out there and stuff and figure it out, and they took and drilled a core sample thing down through this thing, some 70 foot or whatever, and they said, well, after looking at it, looks like we've gone through this event like 11 times. 5 times were major events, and we've only been on the planet knowing that we're we for these last couple here. This is something that automatically happened. And I remember a paper coming out where the guy was showing, which I've showed you before on here, when they talk about global warming, hell, the warmest period we've had since the last ice age was way back here, way back when we say that we weren't doing cattle or anything, no cow farts or anything, and there was so many less people on the planet. We weren't exotically making long words and trash that were, chlorophyll, putting it out in the, all the places and everything. And sure, that's gotten worse, and chemicals and everything, but hell, these events happened before many times when we weren't even here. And so this cow fart thing gets to be just a joke. For if it gets a little warmer, it's going to end up being just like it was 60,000 years ago, and again another 100,000 years before that. For we've gone through these ice ages, and in the in-between, it slowly warms up, and then those ice cubes in your drink that you have sitting there, don't they melt? I'll be damned, they do melt. Now, the only way to fix that is to go back in the ice age and to stick your glass in the freezer. I don't think anybody wants that, but we're just short of having another ice age here, and everybody's freaking out on global warming. If you look at the heartbeat of the last ice ages, and we're due, and everybody's freaking out. Well, if you look before, all the little spikes on the top of the heartbeats, we're actually higher than we're currently at. So that shows you something, because the last big thump was at about 38,000 BC. So I agree, and I want to save all the coral reefs. Oh my God, I was all about it, and I was trying to save corals and everything, but I was finding out that a lot of times when you have these events, your alkalinity, your overall pH will try to drop, your water quality's going out in left field. They're not being fed, this, that, and the other happens. Or sometimes it's just like that river's running in and somebody's over here pouring in stuff. And it was so ironic that where this river was pouring in at, that all these reefs were ruined here, but they're ruined here and up like this. And it's like, well, which way does the current go? Well, it's coming around here and pushing off of this, and so it's pulling in this crap and just going, nah, right through the crown of thorns starfish multiplier. Oh my gosh. And then they sit around and they go, it's cow farts. And it's like, no, it's not what's causing this. Now, sure, they're having bleaching events due to warm reefs because, the ocean's not going down. So if it's going down, then you would see this happening, right? But no, the ocean is going up so incredibly fast that during our lifetimes it hasn't reached a centimeter. But these heating events that are happening there, they're getting a little too warm and then cooling off a little too much because they're getting thinner. Well, as the reefs grow up, understand this effect, that as the reefs grow up, they all are growing rock, effectively these calcium skeletons, and getting closer and closer and closer to the sun, and eventually they get up to a point and they die off because they're getting too much. Yeah, they did too well, and they die off. And then sand inundates these things, and there you goes an atoll, and all it takes is for a coconut to come wash up on there and then try to get going, and the sand that's there, and lo and behold, as an island, and then they connect together. Another interesting effect I can add to this is that whenever you see a beach in the world, wherever you are, if there's a beach there, you can discern two different things. That A, there's a coral reef right there off of that beach, but B, it also has parrotfish in it. These cool looking little parrotfish with their little beak, what they do is they go around chewing on these corals, these hard and stagnant corals and staghorn corals and all these things, and they literally chew them up and poop out sand. And so next time you go running your feet through the sand in a beach, you might think of it on a different light, but we steer away from that mentally while we're doing all this. But that sand will slowly fill up around those atoll groups that at the end of their life are dying off and so on, and then all these spriggly things are there, stuff gets trapped in between them, sand fills up from the bottom and starts doing, and lo and behold, we're only years, decades away from it being an island, and then we're only a few hundred years away from it getting big and incorporating others if they're near it. And we're only a few hundred years away from that being something that flourishes and looks like Tom Hanks' Castaway. Exactly. Gilligan's Island, whatever you want to do. So these corals are meant to grow up to a certain point and die off, and when they get into too much shallows, it dies off, and it looks like through time that they die off during this period of time, not during the Ice Age, for they barely hold on during the Ice Age, and they're only around the equator of the year, of the world, I mean. And as the seas warm back up, they spread back out into it, because any place that gets below 69 degrees for any period of time throughout the year will not sustain corals in it, a la La Nina, El Nino event, but everywhere that there is. You don't think of Australia having a cold event, but about a 4 or 5 degree float will really screw it. And if they're getting up into 81, 82, 83, 84, and then all of a sudden you have plummets that are hitting in the 70s, 76, 78, it's gonna cause some problems. Well, these corals die off and so on. Well, there are guys that have been, whenever I was doing it, I was with a group that finally had the permits to start getting all the Great Barrier Reef corals, and everybody says, oh no, now you're really going to ruin it. No, they were actually checking it out biologically, And these people were taking some corals and fractionating them into pieces and taking them back to that crown of thorns area and replanting them, and have reclaimed a hell of amount. I used to have a poster in my shop showing you the places that they have that they're reclaiming currently, and all these red-rimmed little islands that they had. And this is just it, and it shows it in a blow-up. It's just one little bitty cube off the edge over here of Australia, and then that cube blown up has still got 100 and something reefs all into it. And this is one of the concerned areas and how they're gaining it back. Well, they're having trouble in some of these areas, and a lot of it's still because that farm thing still exists down that river. Yeah, now they started trying to be more careful, but they're still doing it. And so if they didn't have that effect as the not secondary but third area effect, if you will, we wouldn't even be talking about this much. Well, oh yeah, they would too, because it's the agenda. Oh man, it's the agenda. You've got to get on board with their agenda. Well, I agree that we should all go towards solar-powered cars and all this stuff, but we're not there yet. And in between, we're not going to take and try to ruin and chastise people for doing what's been going on for hundreds of thousands of years, are we? Well, some people will, to try to gain power over you and say that we should do these things. And I understand a preemptive strike is in order. Well, these credible Caucasian scientists have been over this and invented the idea of save the world and save the whales and save the everything. So amazingly, we're doing those things, and while we're doing it, everybody's, oh, you're ruining the world. And it's like, we're trying to save the world. It's ironic. It's just the way you look at it. Activists come up and show at these places where these guys are talking about how they're saving the reefs, and the activists show up and they go, you're ruining the world. It's like, no, you could talk to anybody but us, but here you are. So they're taking and repopulating this with a lot of the corals that are there. And in the process, they've realized that they need to do somewhat crop rotation, but differently. There are areas of the reef that will only grow certain corals. I mean, it's 100 of these and a couple of these and one of those. You go over the next little hump, and it's 100 of that same well with dit, and da. And 100 of these. Well, let's take and farm out those hundreds of whatevers and make room for the others and see if we can make this all work more symbiotically. Well, that's been tried, but ironically, the reason it did that before is because the same type thing goes on, and some of those other corals can't hang, and this one version of staghorn coral that's kind of browny green hangs real good. When I was selling corals and stuff, they were all like, this is all going to go away someday. And I was like, man, I understand your thoughts and your feelings on this, but actually there's so many of them, it's not even funny. And with people starting to aquaculture and grow things in captivity and such, we're actually saving it, and we're finding out little tweaks that are causing the ocean's problems in our little aquariums, which is a microcosm of the big thing. And in doing so, we're figuring out ways to save things, like these cool tiger-striped clams that I showed you pictures of before. So they show you corals like this turbinaria, what's known as a sunflower coral. And of course it looks like sunflowers. But this thing doesn't grow off the light at all. It has a beta-carotene type effect inside of it, making its orange effect to it. There's a few different colors. One's fleshy, one's yellow, two different colors of yellow, orange, a yellow and orange mix, a green and a black version of it. And they create corals. And this old black coral and things like that people used to make jewelry out of and everything, because it's not just a white skeleton, it has other effects to it. This is not necessarily one of them, but it grows under the bottom sides of reefs and very, very deep, and isn't one of those affected, although it's in the article about bleaching corals. And it's like, well, the heat can affect that, but it's not even caused by the same effect, so it's not really the same thing. So whenever you look at a coral and you see that the inside mouth part of it is green, but the tubes are kind of brownish, but on the tips are kind of yellowish, what's causing that? Well, certain types of zooxanthellae, which is a unicellular algae creature, like to grow in certain places on certain corals, and you get variations. Can you get one with red tipped? It's pretty rare, but there's a pink tip version, kind of purpley pink tipped version. In fact, there's a purplish tip and a pink tip version. So here's these turbastria, or pagoda cup style headed corals that are there. There's one called a pagoda cup. That's not it at all. These are the sunflowers, and this is the more orange version, which is the yellow version we were looking at before. And here's real neat. Here's Nemo. Yeah, Percula clowns, but there's a lot of different kinds of clowns. In fact, I just saw some, I think it was on the last page. There were Clarky clowns, just 2 bands on them and so on. But they're inside of anemone here, but that anemone is a rare color form, worth a lot of money too, because it's yellow and got little purplish violet tips on it. And man, that's a lemonade. And raspberry lemonade. People will pay hundreds of dollars for that because it's rare to get one in. Do they have them out in the wild a lot? Yeah, there's a bunch of them, but if they take them all out of the wild, then there won't be any more. So they're trying to propagate this and do these things. Here's a coral that's bleached out and thing, but if you look, it was just brown in the first place, and the spots happening onto it. Usually this is from somebody putting it in their aquarium and giving it far too much light, and it's just burning up from the top down, and the angled sides are the only thing that are growing. Sometimes right about here, you drop it down in your aquarium to lower, it tries to regrow, make it or break it, flip a coin, do whatever, and the sides made it be the only part that really continues to grow after that.
Eyeball shotgun. Yes. You get ox.
I got shotgun. So there's a lot of these corals, and you can get ones that are propagated here, and this thing all died off except for the little spriggles on the end, and they could pop that off of there, still in the live part of it, re-stick it back on a place, and get it all to regrow again. Although it may do what's called reversion. It's kind of a weird term, I always thought, because they say, well, reversion is like going back to another color. So they'd have to have said, well, it was this color, but when you got it, it was that color, but it reverted back to that color. Well, how do they know it ever was that color? So it's not really reversion in any way. It's just a weird term. So here's a good picture of somebody's coral reef, and they've got brain corals and frog spawns, different colors that are all over this. But this is somebody who's handpicked nice corals, like I used to sell, and putting them all in and making a super flower display. Whenever you make your wildflower garden, you don't just pick one kind usually, although sometimes people do for a look. You don't pick one kind usually. You mix in with ground cover and this, that, and the other, in different shapes and different colors, and snapdragons and this, that, and the other, and sunflowers, and you try to get all of that going on. So it's got this bouquet effect, and that's what you try to do mainly in corals and stuff. So they talk about how corals become bleached and things that happen, but some of this is quite natural. Some of this is nothing that we can affect. You can't take an iceberg down to Australia somehow and leave it just upwind to where it keeps the thing happen. You can turn off the guy that's putting the phosphates and the nutrient in the water up the river and the creeks that are going on there, and that'll help the situation. But if it's already doing this retardation basically and dying off and forming an atoll, then that's what it's doing. Understand that live rock that you look at, that these guys are all sitting on, are corals that lived and died, and then a layer of purple calcareous algae that's not bad, it's a plating algae that grows off calcium, will grow over it in layers and layers like paint. But as that's going on, little other corals are landing on them out in the wild that spawn and trying to regrow new ones. Doesn't happen much in captivity because your filtration takes them out and so on. But it has definitely happened with a myriad of different corals. But in doing so, they're building that reef and that rock up. And if we were to come back 100 years from now, we would be looking in the middle of a rock, for it would have grown up out of the thing. And how close are we? Well, it looks like